Now, every week on this show, we do our bit to illustrate that politics isn't quite as polarised as the headlines might sometimes suggest. And we do that by introducing you to two political frenemies. That's politicians from across the political divide who get on with one another and have worked together for the common good. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Conservative MP and former Education Secretary Kit Malthouse. Kit, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
Also alongside Kit is his political frenemy, Green Party peer, Jenny Jones, Baroness Jones. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Well, I think it's a pleasure. We'll see.
Here's hoping, eh? Look, let's keep our fingers crossed. But look, we always find out how this friendship began. So, Kit, let me start with you. When was the first time you met Jenny? Do you remember?
So I met Jenny when I was elected to the London Assembly. She'd been a London Assembly Green member. The electoral system on the London Assembly allowed these, I don't know, what's a polite word, minority parties. I was going to say fringe, but minority parties to get seats. And Jenny had got a list seat and I got elected for a constituency in central London. And we became friends, I guess, because we both were on the Metropolitan Police Authority, a body that no longer exists. I was made Deputy Mayor for Policing, and Jenny was, what would you call a one-woman ginger group on the Police Authority, taking on the might of the Met Police. And we worked together on that during what was actually a very difficult and challenging period for the Met. They were struggling with knife crime in London. They had lots of problems in terms of leadership. The finances were under pressure. And it was pretty clear that the organisation itself was not completely functional, shall we say. And, it was my job to try and lead it from a political point of view into broad sunlit uplands, and it's Jenny's job to point out where I was failing, which she did on a very regular basis, which was her job. But we became friends through that.
Jenny, is that how you remember it?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, it is quite odd, I think, when you have somebody whose views are so different from one's own, but you can still talk in a civil way and even a friendly way. And that is brilliant, actually, because it is easier to get, for me, it was easier to get my point across if people liked me a little bit or trusted me. And it's been the same in the House of Lords. That's been an experience about being a ginger group.
Now, you've mentioned to us, Jenny, that there's very little that you two agreed on, and yet you are friends, you are civil to each other. We're going to get on to some of the news of the week that perhaps saw Parliament not shine at its brightest light earlier this week. Do you think, Jenny, that when we look at the Commons, for example, and indeed we might as well just focus on it now, what happened on Wednesday, do you think that that's the lasting impression that people get? Because obviously often those days are featured in the news lines and videos, and people tend to look at Parliament and just see people angry, people throwing insults at each other. Is that a fair depiction of how politics is working at the moment?
I think it's got much worse. I try not to watch the Commons too much because it's all so rude. And in the House of Lords, we do try to be polite when we're pushing the stiletto between the ribs. I think politics has got much, much tougher, and people, particularly in this, after 14 years of a Tory government, we are all struggling. I mean, the legislation that we're getting through the House of Lords is absolutely appalling. And just before the programme, Kit and I were talking about a bill that's come through, and it was something we actually agreed on. So that was progress in an ongoing friendship.
For attention to the Labour Party today calling for the whip to be removed from Conservative MP Lee Anderson after he made dangerous and divisive comments, this is the Labour Party's words, about the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting said the former Tory Deputy Chairman was engaging in outright racism and Islamophobia. Lee Anderson was quoted as saying that the Islamists have got control of Khan and they've got control of London. Jenny Jones, do you think that perhaps what MPs do outside the House contributes to that atmosphere inside the House?
I think that there are certain MPs who really ought not to have their seats anymore, and Lee Anderson is one of them. He is somebody who is so divisive, and his comments about Sadiq Khan are just complete nonsense. I watched Ken Livingstone for 8 years and Boris Johnson for 8 years up close, and I know what a good mayor is. Now, Boris Johnson wasn't it, and I know Kit will disagree with that. But Sadiq Khan, I think, does his best. And I completely agree with Labour here, which is not something I often say, in fact, almost never. But Lee Anderson really ought to lose the whip. And personally, I think he should be kicked out of Parliament altogether. Let's hope his constituents feel like that as well.
Kit Malthouse, what are your views? Quite a lot of your colleagues, Nusgani, Sajid Javid, have all condemned Lee Anderson's comments today. Would you like to join them?
Look, Lee is a friend of mine. I know Lee well, but I think he's let himself down with his comments. I do. And I think he should apologise, if I'm honest with you. I mean, I think, from my point of view, and I think a lot of Londoners, and I know London well, think Sadiq Khan's been a completely hopeless mayor on all sorts of things. But I've never been the sort of politician that demonises the other side. I think people are wrong and misguided in what they do, and they can be incompetent as well. But this is, I mean, it's not right, and I think Lee should retract it and apologise.
If he doesn't, should he lose the whip?
Well, that would be a matter for the party. I mean, it's not for me to intervene on those things. But as I say, I think Lee, at his heart, is a good man, and I think he's let himself down. And I think he's got, I don't know, overexcited, whatever it might be. I like to try and see the best in people, but I do think he should retract it and he should apologise. Yes, and I think a lot of people will be offended by what he said, and I hope he's said it in the heat of the moment.
Sadiq Khan has released a statement saying the comments are anti-Muslim and are racist. Is that how you see them?
Well, I just think they're wrong, and I think he should, as I say, he should retract them. Do I think Lee is a racist? No, of course I don't. And as I said, at heart, I think he's a good man. And I think he's trying to do the right thing by his constituents. But I do think he's got this wrong, and I think he should retract it and apologise.
Whilst we're on, go ahead, Jenny. Yes.
Could I say something about that? I mean, it's not the first time he said some really provocative, damaging, and divisive comments. And so, I'm touched that Kit can still say that Lee Anderson is a good man, but that's not the way he comes across to the majority of us. And what he said was hugely offensive. And I'm sorry, personally, I don't think an apology is good enough.
Well, whilst we're still on the subject, I wonder, Kit Malthouse, also what you make of other comments this week. For example, Suella Braverman, former Home Secretary, written an article in The Telegraph saying Islamists are in charge of Britain now. Liz Truss, who you served under as Education Secretary, was talking in America to Steve Bannon, a former advisor to President Trump, saying that a radical Islamic party could win in the Rochdale by-election next week. What is going on with a Conservative Party talking about Islamists taking over Britain?
Well, first of all, I mean, I found Suella's comments, and again, Suella is a friend, I found them faintly ridiculous. I mean, last time I looked, we've been in power for 14 years, so we've got a fairly hefty majority in the House of Commons. And so we're running the country, whatever Jenny might think about that. So I found it faintly ridiculous. I don't really know what she means. And similarly, Liz Truss seems to have got a bit overexcited with the cameras on her in America. I mean, and this speaks to something that Jenny and I know about in our relationship. I mean, Jenny does say provocative things from time to time, and she will say things that are sometimes offensive. That's part of the job. But when you're dealing with complicated and sensitive issues about the nature of our society and how we all live together, we all have a duty to be temperate in our language and to try and be nuanced about our views. And one of the things I'm afraid that social media has driven lots of politicians towards is to become a kind of political shock jocks where the lure of the likes, those sweet likes on social media, mean that you think you have to say things that are borderline offensive to get noticed. And I just hope that we can return to a more civilized dialogue and not use hyperbole in the past. Now, I'm not immune to that myself. Jenny once rang me up and scolded me for using the word hysterical in relation to, I don't know if it was in relation to you, Jenny, but in relation to someone. And she scolded me, and I've always lodged that in my brain that I need to be reasoned and careful about my language. And I would advise all colleagues to do the same.
Okay. Just before we move on, because I really want to get your thoughts on some policing issues that have come up. And of course, you both are exactly the right people to talk about policing. But just before we move on from this, Jenny, I also wanted to get your thoughts on former Prime Minister Liz Truss. She's also facing calls to have the Conservative whip removed after her remarks made across the Atlantic at the Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington, D.C. Liz Truss used the event to claim that her efforts in Number 10 to cut taxes was sabotaged by the administrative state, the so-called, and I quote here, deep state. She also appeared on a far-right TV channel at a conference alongside Steve Bannon, where she claimed that she was not holding the levers of the country when she came to power, but the Bank of England were. Let's have a quick listen to what she had to say.
What I discovered was that I was not holding the levers. The levers were held by the Bank of England, by the Office of Budget Responsibility. They weren't held by the Prime Minister or the Chancellor. And I think that's a massive, that's a massive problem.
Hang on. You're saying the central bank, the Bank of England, is one of the things that controls it. Are you a conspiracy theory person? You almost sound like Worm. You're MAGA.
What I'm saying, Steve, is that if the Bank of England governor can't be sacked and the Prime Minister can be sacked, then the Bank of England governor is going to have more power than the Prime Minister. And that is a problem in a democracy.
I mean, I don't know where to start there. She fails, of course, to mention that the governor of the Bank of England is appointed by the Treasury and the governor of the Bank of England can also lose the confidence of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor and therefore has to go. But Jenny, what do you make of her remarks?
I just think it's bananas. She bankrupted the country virtually. And I think she's almost got no right to sort of hypothesize about what's happening in Britain, because I think the whole point was she was totally out of touch and she did not understand what she was doing and the impact that it would have on all of us, but worst of all, on the poorest in society. And so really, what utter nonsense. Could I just come back very quickly to the fact that Keith called me provocative, which, yes, I am. I am very irritating. I try not to be personally offensive. I am very offensive about the government. I admit that, but not personally. And I think Kit is the same. And I think that's part of the respect, the fact that we are, perhaps we're just basically nice people.
You